A single name vanished from the parish list, and with it, a life unraveled. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host, Hunter. I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and share where you're watching from. It's always a joy reading your messages. Let's uncover the truth. A quiet English village, a forged donation, and one death that reveals far too much. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host, Carlos. I'd love to know where in the world you are joining us from today. Reading your comments is truly the highlight of my day. Let's begin. The parish hall of St. Mildred's in Lower Wetherham smelled faintly of beeswax polish and boiled cabbage, a combination both oddly nostalgic and faintly unpleasant. On this particular Thursday afternoon, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Isabel Harting, stood at the head of the long oak table, presiding over the annual donation committee meeting. She was flanked by the usual faces: Mr. Eversler, the retired solicitor, Miss Dulcie Prower, who insisted on knitting during all matters of business, and of course dear Miss Marple, who sat near the window, her expression benign and her lace gloves folded neatly in her lap. The village was preparing for its spring charity fete, a tradition nearly as old as the church itself. The donation list meticulously recorded in an old calfskin ledger tracked every shilling offered by parishioners, whether for the flower stall, the tombola, or the raffle, that morning. Miss Marple had walked over from her cottage on Old Mill Lane not with the express purpose of contributing funds, though she had, as always, brought a tin of her lemon curd, but rather to observe. It was an art she had perfected over decades, sitting, listening, knitting though not today, and noticing what others so often missed. I dare say we've exceeded last year's total, Mrs. Harting said with a touch too much brightness, running a well-manicured finger down the list. Even the Sims boys have donated this time. Pocket money, I assume. Mr. Eversler chuckled. Miracles never cease. They once tried to sell me daffodils they'd picked from my own garden. Oh. Miss Marple said gently, how enterprising, though I wonder. Isabel, did you say the Sims boys, plural? Mrs. Harting blinked. Why, yes, the entry reads Sims family, to pounds marked from Edward and James. But James Sims has been in boarding school in Dorset since January, Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than anyone else. There was a pause. Oh, surely the donation was in both boys' names, said Mrs. Harting, flustered now, brushing at a non-existent crumb on her skirt. Miss Marple offered a placid smile. Of course. One mustn't read too much into bookkeeping, and yet, it is curious, it was not long after the meeting adjourned that the real stir began. At precisely 5:18 p.m., Mrs. Caroline Bromley, a woman known more for her disdain of gossip than her ability to avoid it, stormed into the vicarage garden, skirts muddy and face pale. There's been a terrible discovery, she gasped to the gardener, who promptly dropped his shears into the rhubarb patch. Harold Stemp, the church treasurer, has been found dead in the sacristy, slumped over the donation ledger. The news swept through Lower Wetherham like a summer thunderstorm. By evening, speculation was flowering in every parlour and pantry. He had heart trouble, didn't he? Offered Mrs. Jessup. The butcher's wife. No, said Mrs. Drummond, who ran the tea shop. It was the church money. Mark my words, embezzlement, I shouldn't wonder. But Harold Stemp was devout, countered the grocer. He served with the Home Guard. You're not suggesting he... Miss Marple said nothing. Instead, she sat quietly at the edge of the vicarage lawn with a cup of weak tea, her eyes half closed against the golden dusk. Something in her expression, serene yet attentive, hinted that her mind was already rearranging facts into patterns no one else had noticed, because there had been something odd. Had not there, a boy listed who wasn't present, a donation larger than expected, and now a treasurer, lifeless, sprawled beside a ledger. It was not the first time Miss Marple had sensed a puzzle beneath a veneer of village order. And it would not be the last. She rose with the help of her cane, and as the shadows lengthened over the churchyard, she said quietly to no one in particular, "It always begins with the smallest of things, a name on a list." Or a child who couldn't have signed it, the wind stirred the hydrangeas, and the village held its breath. By the following morning, Lower Wetherham was abuzz with subdued urgency. The kind of urgency peculiar to English villages, where scandal travels not through alarm bells but over garden hedges, in murmured exchanges at the greengrocer, and via the slow drift of lace curtains twitching open to frame peering eyes. The vicar, Reverend Leonard Harting, was seen walking the length of the High Street 3 times before 10 o'clock. He wore the same expression each time, distracted, gentle, vaguely apologetic, as if he had misplaced something important and couldn't quite bring himself to ask who had seen it. At his side was Sergeant Cornish, the local constable, a square-jawed man with a deep love for rules and a shallow capacity for ambiguity. Cornish seemed mildly overwhelmed by the sudden appearance of death within the sacred walls of St. Mildred's. No sign of forced entry, he told Mr. Eversler outside the post office, speaking with the air of a man who had recently acquired a phrase from Scotland Yard and was eager to use it. "But the ledgers have been moved, open. The poor man had his hand on it. Curious," said Mr. Eversler, brushing a flake of pastry from his coat. "Though I must say, Harold was prone to nodding off in odd places. He once fell asleep during my reading, except this time he didn't wake up," Sergeant Cornish replied solemnly. Meanwhile, inside the vicarage parlour, Miss Marple was having a second cup of tea with Isabel Harting. The tray between them bore neat slices of Madeira cake, but neither woman had touched a piece. "Such a dreadful business," Isabel said, pressing a handkerchief to her lips though she had not cried. "And on church grounds, no less. Harold Stemp. Well, he could be gruff, but he was always thorough with the accounts, never missed a farthing. Indeed," said Miss Marple, carefully stirring her tea, "and yet something doesn't quite settle, does it? His passing in the sacristy, with the ledger no less." Isabel looked uneasy. "You think something was wrong?" "Oh, I make no accusations," Miss Marple said with a warm smile. "Only patterns, you know. Human nature, repeated gestures. I've found over the years that when a person dies in the very act of examining financial records, it is rarely a coincidence. Across the village, conversations of similar tone played out in kitchens, bakeries, and even the modest public library. Most were speculative, some defensive. A few tiptoed into the territory of suggestion. "Well, Harold never trusted the bank," Mrs. Jessup whispered to the milkman. "Kept records in that dreadful brown ledger, and a drawer full of cash at home. You don't do that unless you're hiding something." "I'll tell you what it is," Mr. Dawes, the butcher, said while trimming a rack of lamb. "He found out someone had been skimming, or worse, and whoever it was made sure he wouldn't tell." "Now that's nonsense," Mrs. Drummond interjected from the doorway. "He was 73. It could have been his heart. Could have," Dawes replied. "But now the police are sniffing round the donation list, aren't they?" Indeed they were. By mid-afternoon, Sergeant Cornish had borrowed the ledger from the sacristy and was combing through it line by line, a furrow permanently etched between his brows. The names were handwritten in neat columns, most with familiar amounts, half a crown here, 5 shillings there. Then, just past the middle of the page, stood a curious entry: Sims family, to pounds, marked from Edward and James. Cornish tapped the page with a thick finger. "Young James Sims has been in school for months. How's he donating anything?" The Reverend Harting looked over his shoulder. Perhaps his parents wrote his name in for him. Cornish didn't look convinced. Maybe, but then why not just write Sims family? Seems odd to specify. He jotted a note in his own small pad and glanced toward the window. where Miss Marple stood outside, speaking gently with the gardener. "I suppose I ought to ask the old girl," he muttered. "She usually knows more than she lets on." It was the peculiar genius of Miss Marple that she had never appeared intrusive. Unlike many of the village's matrons, she never badgered nor bulldozed, she simply noticed. And what she had noticed now, while the others scrambled about discussing ledgers and motives, was that Mrs. Audrey Sims, the mother in question, had been unusually quiet, not silent, but careful. As though each word she uttered had first been examined, polished, and filed down before being offered aloud. Miss Marple found her near the bakery, admiring the day's bread through the shop window. "Such lovely poppy loaves today," Miss Marple said gently. Audrey turned, startled. "Oh, Miss Marple, good afternoon. I was just—" She trailed off. "I dare say you've had a trying morning." Miss Marple continued. "The whole village rather turned inside out, and such talk about the donation list." Audrey pressed her lips together. "It's all very distressing. Harold was a kind man. Yes, and meticulous. One could rely on his records being precise. I remember when he noticed a halfpenny missing from the flower funds and spent a week finding it." Audrey gave a thin smile, but her eyes flickered. "And how are your boys?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "James must be nearly done with the term." Audrey blinked. Yes, he's doing well. I mean, as well as one can from a distance, quiet, so thoughtful of him to make a donation to the fete while away." Audrey's hand, which had been adjusting her scarf, froze mid-air, then resumed. "Oh, well, Edward insisted on putting both names. Sentiment, I suppose. Of course, sentiment is often a reason we do peculiar things." Miss Marple smiled, offered a pleasant nod, and moved along, but in her mind something had shifted, like a painting that, when hung slightly askew, suddenly revealed a shadow in its background. By evening, word came that an autopsy would be conducted. Dr. Wolsey, the county coroner, had arrived just before dusk with a young assistant and a face that betrayed little optimism. Miss Marple stood by the churchyard path as the body was removed with quiet ceremony. She watched, hands folded around her purse. "A stroke," murmured a passerby. "No blood," said another. "Perhaps poison," a third added, eyes wide. But Miss Marple said nothing. She was thinking not about how Harold had died, but about how he had lived, about what he had been doing in the sacristy with that ledger, about James Simpson's name in the donation list and the precise, deliberate incues to write it. There was something there, and just like that the piece of Lower Wetherham, which had for years been wrapped in soft whereupon comfort, had begun to unravel thread by thread, secret by secret, and Miss Marple, with her delicate gloves and far-seeing eyes, had already begun to knit it back together into something that would reveal the truth. The morning after the coroner's visit dawned crisp and cold, a light mist still clinging to the grass like a breath unwilling to be exhaled. Lower Wetherham, ever proud of its appearance, continued its routines with a sort of brittle normalcy. The post was delivered precisely at 8. The bell at St. Mildred's rang for morning prayers, and Miss Marple, wearing her grey wool coat and small straw hat, walked down to the grocer's with a basket on her arm, pausing now and then to examine tulips or exchange a few pleasantries with passers-by. But beneath the town's orderly surface, something had shifted. Conversations, though still politely framed, now carried a subtle edge, a caution, a calculation. "He looked so peaceful, they say," murmured Mrs. Drummond to her assistant while arranging raspberry scones behind the tea-shop counter. "Then how could it be poison?" The girl whispered back. "I didn't say poison, but Dr. Wolsey's face, oh, I've never seen him so pale, and you know how stout he is with his opinions." Miss Marple, quietly choosing a tin of Darjeeling nearby, made no comment. But she did observe that Mrs. Drummond had replaced her apron 3 times since opening, an unconscious tick, perhaps, in the face of uncertainty. Later that day, Sergeant Cornish called a public statement in the parish hall. Only a handful of villagers were present, those who'd made a habit of knowing everything first: Mr. Eversler, Mrs. Prower, Miss Lockett the librarian, and, naturally, Miss Marple. The constable cleared his throat and folded his hands behind his back. Dr. Woolsey has completed his preliminary report. It appears Mr. Stamp's death was not natural, a breath caught in the room. There was a substance found in his system, an alkaloid compound consistent with foxglove, digitalis, to be specific. Mrs. Prower gasped. Why, that grows outside the church gate. My brother used to say 1 petal could stop a man's heart. Yes, Cornish said gravely, and someone appears to have done just that. But why? Asked Miss Lockett, her voice trembling. What possible reason could anyone have for killing Harold Stamp? Miss Marple's voice was gentle but distinct. Perhaps the better question is, what had Harold recently discovered? Cornish turned his gaze to her. You seem to think it's something to do with the donation list. I merely observed that he died with it open in front of him, that he was, so to speak, in the act of checking accounts. One must consider the possibility that he had noticed something irregular. Mr. Eversler cleared his throat. I handled estate accounts for 40 years. If you want to hide something, you bury it in the middle of the page, never the top, never the end. The middle of a ledger is the best place to tuck away mischief, indeed, Miss Marple said, and in the middle of that page, we find the Sims boys' curious donation. The room fell quiet. At that moment, as if summoned by mention, Edward Sims himself entered the hall. Shoulders hunched and face tight, he was a tall man in his late 30s, a bank clerk by trade, and known for his punctuality, his quiet demeanour, and, some whispered, his ever-watchful eye. Sergeant, he said stiffly, my wife told me there's been talk about our donation. Cornish nodded. It's just routine questioning, Mr. Sims. Edward's jaw twitched. If anyone thinks we had anything to do with Harold's death, no one's accusing anyone, Cornish said, though his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple rose slowly. Might I ask, Mr. Sims, who recorded the donation? Edward glanced at her, wary. My wife wrote the cheque. I filled in the line in the ledger during Sunday service. Harold wasn't there. He often left it open for additions during the offertory. And the inclusion of Jammer's name. Edward hesitated. He asked me too, in a letter, said he missed the fete, and wanted to feel included. Miss Marple tilted her head. Forgive me, but I thought James was at a strict boarding school where letters are reviewed. Edward's eyes narrowed. What are you implying? Nothing at all, Miss Marple replied kindly, only that is a lovely sentiment, almost too lovely, don't you think? Cornish stepped in. All right. Let's not turn this into a trial. Mr. Sims, I'd like to have a look at that letter, if it still exists. Edward hesitated a moment long, then nodded, if I can find it, after he left. The room began to murmur once more. Miss Marple remained seated, her thoughts turning not just to Edward's carefully worded statement, but to something even more subtle, the precise moment when he grew tense. It had not been when Cornish spoke of poison, nor when Miss Lockett questioned motive. It had been when the line in the ledger of the act of writing was mentioned, that, she thought, was important. Later that afternoon, she visited the church. Sacristy herself, Reverend Harting, though surprised, allowed her entry. The room smelled faintly of old polish, vestments, and something sharper, perhaps dust or candle soot. The donation ledger still rested on the table, though now closed. Miss Marple asked to see it, and with a quiet nod, the vicar obliged. She turned the pages slowly, running a gloved hand just above the inked lines. The Sims donation stood out to pounds, far more than most had given, and the handwriting. Not the same as the entry above or below, it was measured, precise, but oddly flat, lacking the small hesitations of someone adding a name in generosity. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She thanked the Reverend, replaced the ledger, and stepped outside. In the churchyard, she paused near the foxglove bed. The blooms danced lazily in the afternoon breeze, lovely, delicate, deadly. Miss Marple plucked a small blossom and held it delicately. "People forget," she said softly, "that murder doesn't always arrive in anger. Sometimes it's planned with the same care as embroidery, quiet, patient, almost polite." She turned back toward the village with a sense that the threads of the mystery were tightening. Someone in Lower Weatherham had lied subtly, precisely, and Harold Stemp, faithful treasurer, had likely paid the price for discovering it. What Miss Marple needed now was not more gossip, but a glimpse into human motive, envy, fear, pride, and, perhaps, one more look at who had stood nearest the sacristy that morning. She would begin, as always, not with the loudest voices, but with the quietest corners, because that was where the truth usually waited, by Friday morning. Sergeant Cornish had compiled what he confidently called a preliminary list of persons of interest. That was how he phrased it when he stopped by Miss Marple's cottage, removing his helmet out of courtesy and wiping the early dew from his moustache. Miss Marple welcomed him in. Of course, there was already a pot of tea on, and a plate of lavender shortbread neatly stacked on her china tray. He declined the shortbread, but accepted the tea, seated stiffly in her lace-trimmed sitting room, his notebook balanced precariously on one knee. "Well," he said, after a pause, "we've narrowed it down. 3 people had access to the ledger on the morning Mr. Stemp died. Edward Sims. Naturally, he claims to have written the donation the previous Sunday, but no one saw him do it. Then there's Miss Felicity Dane, the sacristy cleaner, who was in the church early for dusting, and lastly, Reverend Harting himself." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "And what of the poison?" Cornish sighed. "Digitalis isn't difficult to come by. Not around here. Every other garden got foxgloves, but getting enough of it into a man without his noticing, that takes care, subtlety. Not just plucking a flower and dropping it into tea." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And have you considered what Mr. Stemp might have eaten or drunk that morning?" "Not much," Cornish admitted, according to the vicar's wife. "Just a single cup of weak Darjeeling from the church pantry." "And who brewed it?" "The vicar." Harold liked it mildly. He left him alone in the sacristy while he fetched some hymn sheets. Miss Marple looked thoughtful, and no one else came in. Not that he recalls, but memories tend to tidy themselves after the fact, don't they? There was a long pause as Cornish sipped his tea, glancing absently around Miss Marple's drawing room. He always felt slightly out of place here, as though every cushion, doily, and porcelain figurine were quietly judging his deductions. "And your thoughts, Miss Marple?" he asked finally. "I know you've been watching everyone." She smiled faintly. "I observe, Sergeant, that is all. But in this case, I wonder if you're looking at proximity more than motive." Cornish frowned. Meaning, Miss Marple said gently, that the person who delivered the blow isn't always the one with the most convenient access. Sometimes it's the one with the most to lose. That afternoon, the village was awash with subtle tension. Edward Sims had not produced the supposed letter from James. He claimed it had been misplaced in a spring cleaning. Audrey, his wife, looked pale and withdrawn at the greengrocer's, and several people remarked on the way she avoided eye contact when Harold Stamp's name was mentioned. Miss Felicity Dane, on the other hand, had taken to declaring her innocence loudly for some tastes, a sharp-featured woman of about 50 with a voice that could peel paint. She had been cleaning the sacristy for years. No one had ever questioned her access before, but now, with Harold dead, The fact that she was in and out of the church before most people had opened their curtains was suddenly suspect. I've nothing to hide. She told Mr. Dawes, the butcher, as he sliced cold ham behind the counter. I dusted the altar rail, wiped the pew ends, and left. Didn't even see Harold that morning. Must have come in after me. Mr. Dawes grunted non-committally, but word of her protestations was already racing down the high street later that day. Miss Marple made her way to the Simses' cottage under the pretext of returning a borrowed teacup. Audrey answered the door with tired eyes. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind. I thought you might need a little quiet company," said Miss Marple kindly. "I find that people often talk too much when they're anxious and say too little when they are truly afraid." Audrey blinked. I don't know what you mean." They sat in the modest parlour, the floral wallpaper slightly faded from the years. Edward was not at home at the bank, presumably. Miss Marple took out her knitting. "You know, I often think about what people choose to write down, what they preserve on paper versus what they merely say." Audrey said nothing. "That donation entry," Miss Marple continued softly, "it felt deliberate, not affectionate. You see, more like a note left behind to prove something, as though it were meant to be seen again later." Audrey stared at her lap. Her voice, when it came, was little more than a whisper. "I told Edward not to write James's name. I said it wasn't right." Miss Marple did not respond. She simply set down her knitting, folded her hands, and waited. After a moment, Audrey continued. "He insisted, said it made the gift look more heartfelt, said people would trust us more that way." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And Harold, did he trust it?" Audrey's eyes shimmered. "I think Harold knew something. He called the house Wednesday evening, asked Edward if he could clarify a detail. Edward told him he was being fussy, and now Harold is dead." Audrey gave a strangled sob and turned her face away. "I didn't, Edward." Couldn't. Miss Marple placed a soft hand on her arm. "We mustn't jump to conclusions, but thank you, my dear. You've told me more than you know." Meanwhile, Cornish had taken it upon himself to question Reverend Harting more directly. The vicar was reluctant but cooperative, offering his recollection of the morning with quiet gravity. "I did leave the sacristy for about 15 minutes, he admitted, to check on a hymn booklet. When I returned, Harold was slumped forward. At first, I thought he'd fallen asleep. You touched the cup." "Yes, took it to the kitchen and rinsed it." "I didn't think so." Cornish made a note when asked about Miss Dane. The vicar gave a slight frown. "She has keys, yes. She's punctual, always. Early, but she's troubled, perhaps. Has been ever since her brother died. They were very close." "Did she get along with Harold?" "Not particularly. They disagreed over the placement of the altar flowers more than once that evening." As the sky dimmed and rain threatened on the horizon, Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the villagers bustle along the high street. The three names were in play now: Sims, Dane, Harting, but something in her bones told her the answer lay not in proximity, nor in old grudges, but in something far more subtle: a gesture. A line written too carefully, a silence that came too quickly. The truth was close, she could feel it, but someone was still playing a part and playing it rather well, and in her experience, the more polished the performance, the more dangerous the secret behind it. Rain fell gently over Lower Weatherham the next morning, soaking the cobbled lanes and polishing the gravestones in the churchyard to a solemn sheen. Miss Marple, standing beneath the small awning of the parish hall, watched the rivulets of water slide down the leaded windows of St. Mildred's. She wasn't fond of the damp, but today it suited the mood of the village. Inside the church, the air was hushed and cool. Reverend Harting had agreed to let her quietly peruse the choir books, ostensibly under the pretext of inspecting water damage from a leak in the north transept. She moved slowly between the pews. her gloved fingers running lightly across the polished wood of the hymn bookshelf. Her expression, as always, was one of mild curiosity, nothing more than an elderly lady checking for mildew. But her eyes were alert. She stopped at the third pew on the left, just behind the choir rail, where a stack of hymnals rested. Carefully, she opened one. Nothing. Another, still nothing. Then, in the third book from the bottom, something unusual caught her eye. A sheet of lined paper, folded crisply and tucked between hymns 143 and 147. She slipped it out with care, eyes narrowing slightly. The handwriting was unfamiliar, slanted, small, but composed. The note read, "It doesn't add up. I checked 3 times. He says James signed it, but the ink's out of fresh and the date doesn't match. Keep this quiet. I'll speak to him after the meeting." There was no name, no signature. But Miss Marple had read enough correspondence over the years to recognize something deeper than mere suspicion. This was a warning, and likely the last one Herald Stemp ever gave. She slipped the note into her handbag and sat for a moment in the pew, letting the coolness of the stone seep around her thoughts. The mention of ink, a date discrepancy, it suggested that Herald had already uncovered the inconsistency before he died, and he had planned to confront someone about it. Miss Marple stood. Her decision made, she would pay a visit to the village. Stationer, Mr. Fenley, the stationer and amateur watercolourist, greeted Miss Marple with a fond smile as she entered his shop just before noon. "Miss Marple, braving the rain, are we only for a good cause?" she replied cheerily. "Tell me, Mr. Fenley, do you still keep your old log of who purchases ink and pens?" "You always were wonderfully meticulous," he chuckled modestly. "Guilty, yes, I don't like my supplies vanishing without a trace. I wonder," she said, lowering her voice, "whether someone recently purchased a new bottle of ink. Something very dark, possibly for ledger work." Fenley raised his eyebrows. "Why, yes, about 10 days ago, come to think of it. Bought one of my German inks of rich colour, barely needs a second stroke. Do you recall who purchased it?" He tapped his chin. "A man, definitely, middle-aged, quiet, paid in coin, didn't stay long. Could have been Edward Sims, though I can't be certain. Could he have bought it for someone else?" Fenley shrugged. "Possibly, but it was a personal ink, not something for a child's fountain pen." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, just idle curiosity. Thank you, Mr. Fenley, you've been most helpful." That afternoon, she returned to her cottage and laid the anonymous note flat on her desk. She studied the words again. Herald had clearly suspected that the donation entry had been tampered with recently. The mention of ink and mismatched dates suggested he had compared handwriting and perhaps even the flow of ink. A man who spent decades balancing shillings and pence would notice such things. More importantly, someone else must have known he'd seen it. She reflected on Audrey's trembling voice. Edward's had perfect answers, Miss Dane's loud denials, and the vicar absent for 15 crucial minutes. But no one had reason enough to act unless Herald had threatened to reveal what he'd found. Miss Marple pulled out the donation ledger notes she had copied earlier. Edward Sims' entry stood out again, not just because of the unusual inclusion of his son's name, but because of the language from Edward and James. Most villagers, when donating, simply wrote Sims family or Edward Sims. The formality was almost staged, and the handwriting too precise, too practiced. She compared it to a thank you note Edward had sent her the previous year for a tray of plum preserves. The loops were different, the spacing unnatural. Her mind quietly confirmed what her instincts already whispered. Someone else had written that entry. Later that evening, Sergeant Cornish came by again, looking slightly flustered. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've had a visit from young Alec Barnes. You remember Chorister, always underfoot, charming boy, eager 2, please. Well, he says he saw Miss Dane with a cloth and a bottle in the sacristy early Wednesday morning, wiping something down, said she looked nervous, and he swears the cloth smelled bitter, foxglove. Miss Marple asked gently, couldn't say, but I've taken her in for questioning. Miss Marple nodded slowly, and what has she said? She says she was dusting, as usual, claims the cloth was just vinegar and lavender for the pews. Miss Marple's gaze softened. That could well be true. You don't think she did it. I think she may have seen something, and perhaps touched something she shouldn't have. Cornish frowned. You always make it sound like a play. Oh. No, Miss Marple replied. Real life is much more complex than the theatre, but Sergeant motives are as old as the Greek tragedies. Money, fear, pride, and sometimes the need to keep someone else's secret. As he left, the rain finally ceased, leaving behind a fresh scrubbed quiet across the village. Miss Marple sat by the fire, the choir book note now tucked into her knitting basket. She wasn't ready to accuse anyone, not yet, but she knew the killer had slipped, not with the poison, but with the ink, with a flourish to exact, and a date to clever, soon. Someone would have to explain how a child at boarding school had made a donation with freshly bought ink and perfect adult script. And when that explanation failed, the mask would begin to crack. Saturday morning arrived with a restless hush over Lower Wetherham. The rain had cleared, but the clouds lingered, casting a pewter sheen across the village rooftops. A strange stillness had crept into the daily rhythm, as if the buildings themselves were waiting for something, a revelation, a reckoning. Miss Marple, having risen early, took her morning stroll with purpose. Her steps, though unhurried, traced a path she had already considered carefully. She paused in front of the post office, peered briefly into the window of the haberdashery, then turned toward the library. Inside, Miss Lockett greeted her with a cautious smile. Miss Marple, come for the new gardening pamphlets, or perhaps a quiet word? Miss Marple inclined her head. A quiet word, if you don't mind. Somewhere out of earshot, they moved to a corner near the window, beneath a shelf of historical fiction no one had disturbed in years. I found something in a choir book, Miss Marple said, keeping her voice low. A note. It seems Harold Stemp knew something was wrong with the donation list. He meant to confront someone. Miss Lockett paled. He mentioned something strange to me just before the church meeting. Said he thought the ledger had been touched by 2 hands. I didn't know what he meant at the time. I assumed he meant it figuratively. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. I think he meant it quite literally. And you didn't mention this before. I didn't think it mattered. And to be honest, I was frightened. Harold could be gruff, yes, but kind. I didn't want to become part of whatever this is. Miss Marple's eyes were soft. You already are. My dear, everyone is. Secrets thrive in small places not because they are well hidden, but because everyone's too polite to ask. Meanwhile, at the village constabulary, Sergeant Cornish paced his cramped office. Miss Dane sat across from him, her chin raised stubbornly, her fingers tightly clasped in her lap. I told you, she said for the 3rd time, I used vinegar and lavender oil. It's how I clean the pews. My brother used it for years. Harold's death has nothing to do with me. Cornish leaned back. You were seen wiping down the altar rail before anyone else arrived. And you're known to argue with Harold. Her eyes narrowed. Everyone argues with someone, Sergeant. That doesn't make them killers. But you didn't like him. She hesitated. No, I didn't. He always made me feel small, always questioning how I arranged the flowers, where I put the hymnals. Treated me like an idiot, and that didn't make you angry? Of course it did, she snapped, but not enough to kill him. She took a breath, slower this time. Harold was difficult, but he wasn't wicked. He just thought he knew best. Cornish rubbed his temple. Then help me understand what you were doing. Who else was there? Miss Dane looked down. I thought I saw someone else, just briefly, a man near the back entrance, but I didn't get a proper look. Could have been Edward Sims or the vicar. It was only a shadow. Cornish's pen hovered over the paper. You didn't mention this before, because I wasn't sure, and I don't want to be wrong. He sighed. Well, come back to that. Miss Marple, now on her second visit of the day, climbed the narrow path to the vicarage. Isabel Harting greeted her at the door with tired warmth. Oh, Jane. Come in, we've had a rather unsettling morning. Reverend Harting received an anonymous letter. May I see it? Isabel hesitated, then led her into the drawing room. On the table, beside a half-finished pot of tea, lay a small envelope. Inside was a note, typed and unsigned. You know more than you're saying. Confession is easier than shame. Tell the truth before someone else does. Miss Marple read it twice before speaking. Typed, no handwriting. But that doesn't hide the sentiment. Someone's trying to pressure the Reverend into revealing something. A bluff, I expect. Isabel lowered herself into a chair. Do you think someone believes Leonard poisoned Harold? Miss Marple's tone was even. I think someone wants others to think so. And if I were to hazard a guess, I'd say it's someone who's becoming nervous. Isabel twisted her hands in her lap. He's a good man, Jane. And he truly believed Harold died of natural causes until the coroner's report. Miss Marple patted her arm gently. The truth always finds a way, Isabel, sometimes with a whisper, sometimes with a scream. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the bank where Edward Sims worked. The interior was tidy, clinical, with the dull air of secrecy that always clung to places where money was stored. Edward met her in the side room, summoned by a polite inquiry at the counter. He seemed surprised to see her. Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting it. No one ever does, she said kindly. I wondered if we might discuss ink. He stiffened. Ink? Yes, you. See, Mr. Fenley remembered selling a bottle of special German ink 10 days ago. Very dark, very permanent, rather like the kind used to enter your son's name in the parish ledger. Edward's lips pressed into a line. I've already told Sergeant Cornish we wrote the donation together, did you? He didn't answer. Miss Marple continued. Softly, Harold Stemp had begun asking questions about that very entry. He noticed the date discrepancy, noticed the freshness of the ink, and he was planning to confront someone. We know this from a note he left in a chore book. Edward paled. I don't know what you're suggesting, he said tightly. I suggest nothing. But I observe Mr. Sims, and I've observed that your wife, Audrey, is a nervous woman, kind, honest, not suited to deceit. He stood, abrupt. If you're accusing me, not at all. But you must understand there's a pattern forming. The donation entry, the ink, the missing letter from James, and now a typed threat sent to the vicar. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, low and bitter, I didn't kill him. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Then you must help us find out who did, by evening. The village had grown tense and brittle. People walked a little faster, spoke a little softer. The sound of suspicion, unspoken but mounting, filled the space between greetings. In her sitting room, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, her needles moving slowly through a row of rose-pink yarn. In her mind, the pieces were nearly aligned. She had seen how Edward looked not when accused, but when reminded of the ink. She had seen how Miss Dane deflected her story, then shifted it, and she had seen Isabel Harting tremble ever so slightly when she mentioned Harold's last visit to the vicarage. Soon the moment would come to gently tug at the final thread, and then the whole thing, ledger, lie, and lethal intent would come undone. The sun rose sluggishly over Lower Wetherham on Sunday morning, casting pale streaks of light across wet rooftops and unopened shutters. The bells of St. Mildred's rang out with their usual cheer. But the tone beneath them felt brittle. It was The first service since Harold Stem's death, and the pews filled with quiet reluctance, as though the villagers feared what might be uttered not from the pulpit, but from each other. Miss Marple arrived precisely 10 minutes early. As she always did, she sat near the back, in her usual seat beneath the stained glass of St. Augustine, and observed. The vicar's sermon was subdued, his voice steady but lacking its usual resonance. His wife sat stiffly in the front pew, her hands clasped tightly, her hat one of those firm, modest things one wore when mourning was inconvenient but socially required. But it was not the Hartings who drew Miss Marple's attention. It was Edward Sims. He entered late, slipping in through the side door with an air of caution, his eyes scanning the room before he took a seat near the rear, not far from Miss Marple. His wife, Audrey, did not join him. That, in itself, was telling. After the service, the usual murmur of chatter began, but it was cautious, delicate. Everyone had questions, and no one wanted to be the first to ask them. Miss Marple, without breaking pace, followed a familiar route toward the sacristy, pausing just as she passed the flower alcove, and there, kneeling among the pale lilies and crimson carnations, was Miss Felicity Dane. She was not arranging the flowers, though she was weeping silently, her shoulders trembling. Miss Marple stepped forward gently. Miss Dane, the woman turned, startled. Her face was blotchy, her hands trembling, but her pride remained intact. "I'm fine," she said hoarsely. "Just tired. You've had quite a week." Felicity gave a short, bitter laugh. "I'm used to being ignored, Miss Marple. Most of the time, people look right through me. But now they think I'm capable of murder." Miss Marple sat beside her on the bench. "It's a difficult thing, being watched suddenly, isn't it? Like having your entire life inspected through a keyhole." Miss Dane wiped her eyes with a crumpled handkerchief. "I didn't kill him. I know I said I disliked him, but I would never. I couldn't. I believe you," Miss Marple said softly. "But I think you saw something that morning, and you're not sure whether to speak, because it might make you a target or worse, an accomplice." Miss Dane said nothing, but her silence felt more like assent than denial. Was it Edward Sims? Miss Marple asked. Felicity's eyes flicked up, wide. I don't know, maybe. I saw a man, dark coat. He went into the vestry, just after I passed through to fetch the brass polish. I didn't hear much, only a voice low, angry." She hesitated, then added, "Then silence. I thought it was nothing." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Sometimes it's the quiet moments we should fear the most." By the afternoon, another ripple passed through the village, one that could not be attributed to gossip. Audrey Sims had vanished. Her neighbour, Mrs. Dudgeon, reported seeing her leave early that morning, suitcase in hand, though she hadn't said where she was going. By noon, word had reached Sergeant Cornish, who promptly began inquiries. There was no sign of her at the train station, nor any record of a hired car. Miss Marple heard the news over tea at the vicarage. Isabel had gone pale again, her teacup rattling softly in its saucer. "This is getting worse by the day," she murmured. Miss Marple said nothing at first, but her eyes, alert behind her spectacles, flicked toward the envelope still resting on the sideboard. The anonymous letter. What if Audrey wasn't running from guilt? She said. What if she was afraid of someone else's? Isabel looked up. "You mean Edward? Or someone trying to make it seem like him? Someone clever enough to plant seeds in several directions?" She turned to the Reverend Harting. Leonard, who else had access to that ledge before Harold's death? Beyond the obvious, he frowned. "Well, there's the Chore boys, I suppose, though they never touch it. Miss Dane, of course, and Mrs. Cranwell." Miss Marple blinked. "Mrs. Cranwell, our parish secretary. She helps file receipts, types notices, that sort of thing." Harold trusted her, And does she keep a typewriter? Of course, in the vestry office. Miss Marple rose, gently smoothing her skirt. I think I should like a word with Mrs. Cranwell. Mrs. Edith Cranwell was a weary woman in her early 60s, with sharp cheekbones and an even sharper tongue. She had run the administrative affairs of the parish for nearly 2 decades with the efficiency of a railway clerk and the discretion of a solicitor. She greeted Miss Marple at the door of her cottage with a polite, tight-lipped smile. I was just about to make tea, she said, though I suppose you have not come for that. Miss Marple returned the smile. No, though a cup would be lovely, inside. The house smelled faintly of lavender polish and baked scones. A framed photograph of a much younger Mrs. Cranwell with a man in military uniform sat on the mantel. As they settled in the parlour, Miss Marple got to the point. You handled the parish ledger at times, did you not? Yes, often Harold would leave it with me to double-check sums before the fete. He was meticulous, but I could read his handwriting better than most. And did you handle it the week he died? No, she said quickly. That week. He kept it close. Said he'd found something odd and needed time to check it. Miss Marple nodded. Did he say what it was? Mrs. Cranwell hesitated. No, only that someone had altered an entry. I assumed it was a small mistake, an overwritten figure. Perhaps, did you type anything that week for the Reverend? Only the usual announcements, and perhaps a note. Mrs. Cranwell froze for half a second. Just long enough. A note. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. The typed threat, sent to Reverend Harting. I believe it came from the vestry's typewriter. Mrs. Cranwell set her cup down. I didn't type any such letter. I believe you, Miss Marple said kindly. But I also believe someone else used that typewriter. Someone who wanted to frighten the vicar. Distract attention. And perhaps even shift suspicion. Mrs. Cranwell swallowed hard. But why the vicar? What would he have to do with it? Miss Marple held up a hand. That's what I'm trying to find out. But the threads are converging now. Audrey Sims has disappeared. Harold left a warning, and someone tried, too late, to muddy the waters. She stood and gently retrieved her handbag. Thank you, Mrs. Cranwell. You've helped more than you realize. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly at her writing desk, her notes laid out in a careful sequence. One thing was now certain: Harold had uncovered a deliberate forgery. He'd written a note about it. He confided in at least one person, and he had intended to confront the forger, and now Audrey had vanished. The question was no longer who had something to hide. It was who was desperate enough to silence anyone who might speak. It was nearly dusk when Miss Marple placed the final piece of her quiet plan into motion. The parlour of her cottage on Old Mill Lane had been immaculately arranged. A second teacup sat ready on the lace-covered table, a plate of ginger biscuits. Between them, a small fire flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows against the chintz armchairs. Outside, the village prepared for supper. Unaware that the final chapter of the mystery was about to begin, she had extended a simple invitation. A cup of tea, nothing more. No suspicions, no hints. Just one of her usual afternoon calls, and, precisely at 6 o'clock, Edward Sims arrived. He looked thinner than usual, paler, a man who had not slept well in days. He removed his hat and gloves in silence, accepted her offer of tea, and sat with the posture of someone waiting for a verdict he already feared. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple said warmly. Pouring the tea, I find it helps to talk with people. Directly, too many whispers about lately, and when people whisper, they begin to invent. Edward gave a half smile, though it did not reach his eyes. There's certainly been a lot of that. Audrey's disappearance hasn't helped. No, Miss Marple said. Gently, people assume the worst. But perhaps she simply needed distance. It's difficult, living near suspicion. Edward stirred his tea slowly. She couldn't take it any more. She said the house felt haunted by guilt. His hand froze. then continued stirring. I suppose that's what everyone thinks. Miss Marple set her cup down. I don't deal in what everyone thinks. I deal in patterns. And there is a pattern here, Mr. Sims. A man is found dead, poisoned, with a parish ledger open before him. A ledger that includes a forged donation. Edward looked up sharply. I told you before. I didn't kill Harold Stemp. No, Miss Marple said. Quietly. But you lied about the entry. You didn't write it. And neither did James. You had someone else do it, didn't you? He opened his mouth. Then I closed it. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. You purchased a bottle of dark ink from Mr. Fenley. It was used to make the entry. The handwriting doesn't match your usual style, nor Audrey's. You were trying to make something appear natural. But Harold noticed. Edward's voice, when it came, was dry. He always noticed, always had to be right. Miss Marple did not speak. She waited. Edward sighed. Deeply. It was about the funds. I.D. took some of the fate money last year. Only a little. Just to cover a shortfall. I meant to return it. But when Harold started reviewing the books again for this year, I panicked. You created the donation to mask the discrepancy. Miss Marple said softly. He nodded. I thought if I made a generous enough donation, if it looked like James had contributed to it, would distract him. Make the numbers balance, at least temporarily. But Harold wasn't a man to be distracted by sentiment. Edward gave a dry laugh. No, he called me 2 days before he died. Said we needed to talk. Said he'd found something strange about the ink. I tried to brush him off, but I could tell he wasn't going to let it go. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. And did you meet him? No, Edward said quickly. I swear it. I didn't go near the sacristy that morning. I was at the bank. There's a record. Then who did? Edward looked at her, his face pale. I don't know. I only know that after he died, I couldn't breathe. I thought perhaps someone had done what I couldn't, to protect me. Audrey was terrified. She said we should confess everything, even if we were not responsible for the death. And then she vanished. Edward rubbed his hands together. She said someone was watching the house, that she felt eyes on her. I didn't believe her at first, but then the letter came. Miss Marple tilted her head. You received one too. He nodded. Slowly, typed, no signature, just said, your secret won't stay buried. I thought it was Harold's handwriting at first, but it wasn't. Just a cold, clipped type. Miss Marple stood and walked slowly to the sideboard. She retrieved a small envelope and handed it to him. It matches this one, sent to the vicar. Typed on the parish machine. Edward studied it, so whoever did it once. You us all to suspect one another, yes, and it worked brilliantly, but the threads are beginning to unravel. You see, Mr. Sims, lies are like dropped stitches. If left alone, they eventually cause the whole pattern to twist. He looked at her with a dawning understanding. Who that? Miss Marple said gently, is what I intend to find out this evening. By 8 o'clock, Miss Marple had arranged a gathering in the Vicarage drawing room. The attendees were a few Reverend Harting and his wife, Miss Felicity Dane, Edward Sims, and Sergeant Cornish. A fire crackled in the hearth, rain tapped at the windows. Miss Marple stood at the centre, her presence calm, almost grandmotherly. I've asked you all here, she began, because I believe the person responsible for Harold Stemp's death is in this room. A gasp came from Isabel Harting. Cornish straightened. Miss Marple continued. It began with a donation, a false one, meant to hide a financial discrepancy. Mr. Sims admits to this, but he did not poison Harold. Someone else took it upon themselves to silence him. Someone who knew the forgery was close to being exposed. Someone with access to the sacristy and a working knowledge of foxglove. She turned to Miss Dane. You saw someone in the sacristy that morning. You said you thought it might be Edward or the vicar. Felicity nodded, voice trembling. just a shadow. Miss Marple looked at Isabel Harting. And you, Isabel. How long did you say your husband was out of the room that morning? Isabel's face paled. 10 minutes, 15. But he was not, Miss Marple confirmed. Because I believe the person who poisoned Harold Stemp did so before he ever stepped into the sacristy that Awning, it wasn't in the tea, it was in the sugar cubes. There was silence. Then, slowly, she turned to Reverend Harting. Leonard, did you or your wife prepare the tea yourself that day? The vicar blinked. No. Isabel set the tray the night before. I only added the hot water. Miss Marple nodded, and that is where the moment happened. 1 sugar cube, laced with digitalis. Left waiting for Harold's morning visit, she turned to Isabel Harting, who sat very still, hands folded tightly. Isabel, her voice was nearly inaudible. He was going to ruin everything. He said he'd report all the mismanaged funds, the administrative errors. Leonard could have been dismissed, humiliated. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. So you acted, not out of hatred, but fear, a fear that the truth would shatter everything you had built. Isabel did not deny it. She only stared into the fire as though the flickering flames could burn the memory from her hands. Cornish stepped forward quietly. Isabel rose, slow and composed. I only meant to delay him. I thought, just enough to make him sick. I didn't know it would kill him. But Miss Marple said nothing more. She only reached for her gloves. The room behind her filling with silence. The truth had emerged, not with a shout, but with a tremble, and the final thread had been pulled. The air in the vicarage drawing room hung heavy after Isabel Harting's quiet confession. No one spoke for several minutes. Even the fire seemed to fall silent, its flames drawing inward, as though unwilling to intrude on what had just transpired. Reverend Harting sat with his head bowed, hands clasped in his lap. The colour drained from his face. Across from him, Sergeant Cornish stood with his notebook still in hand but no longer writing. Edward Sims stared at the rug with blank disbelief, while Miss Felicity Dane looked as though the breath had been knocked out of her. Miss Marple remained by the mantel, her posture as steady as ever, but her eyes, though calm, held a kind of sadness, the sorrow not of surprise, but of quiet recognition. It often happens this way, she said softly, almost to herself, not with hatred or malice, but with fear. And the tragic belief that a little lie, a little drop of poison, might hold the world together. Isabel Harting did not defend herself. She did not weep. Instead, she looked across the room at her husband, at the man whose position, reputation, and quiet dignity she had tried to protect with an act that shattered all three. I only meant to frighten him, she said at last, her voice no more than a thread to make him stop pushing. Harold was relentless. He kept saying there were irregularities, that he'd bring it before the church council. And Leonard's been exhausted for months. The accounts were always tangled old ledgers, lost receipts, half-written notes. I thought if Harold would just step back. She turned her face away. I read somewhere once that foxglove can be used to calm a racing heart. I didn't even use much, but he must have been more fragile than I knew. Cornish stepped forward then, slowly. Mrs. Harting, I'm afraid I'll need to make a formal statement. Reverend Harting raised a trembling hand. She didn't mean to kill him, Sergeant. You can see that, surely. Cornish's voice was gentle. That's not for me to decide, sir, but the Crown will take intent into account. Isabel stood with grace. I'm ready. But before they reached the door, Miss Marple raised one hand. There's one more matter we must address. All eyes turned back to her. The matter of the typed notes. Cornish frowned. You believe she sent those too? Miss Marple shook her head. No. Isabel Harting acted out of desperation, but she would never engage in cruel games. The letters were sent after Harold's death. meant not to cover up a crime, but to stir unrest, to confuse, and perhaps to direct suspicion elsewhere, she turned her gaze to Edward Sims, who stiffened. "I didn't send them," he said quickly, "Miss." Marple looked past him. But someone who knew about the forged donation did. Someone who had something to gain by watching others flounder under blame. Someone who wanted their own mistake buried beneath the noise of others' guilt. From the far corner, Miss Felicity Dane let out a single, shaky breath. Miss Marple turned toward her slowly. "You recognized the ink, didn't you, Miss Dane?" Felicity looked up, eyes brimming with tears. "I never meant. I didn't know Harold would die." Cornish straightened. "Are you saying you wrote the letters?" She nodded. "Yes. After he died, I panicked. I'd seen Edward slip into the sacristy that morning. I thought he might have been the one. I didn't know about Isabel, but I was terrified the vicar would be blamed, and he's been nothing but kind to me since my brother passed. So I thought I could redirect suspicion. Just enough to distract." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "You didn't kill Harold, but you tampered with the aftermath. It's an understandable impulse, but a dangerous one." Felicity bowed her head. "I was afraid," she whispered. "I've always been invisible, Miss Marple. That day, for the first time, I thought I held a little power. I didn't use it wisely." Cornish exhaled and looked toward Miss Marple. "You do have a way of drawing out the truth, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's not so difficult. People don't like to keep secrets. Not really, they weigh too heavily. Sometimes. You need only offer them a quiet place to be heard." The formalities took hours. Sergeant Cornish escorted Isabel Harting to the station, gently, respectfully. He promised she would be allowed to return home that night. Once statements were recorded and the Crown Prosecution Service was contacted. In the meantime, Reverend Harting remained seated in his armchair, hands folded, eyes blank with grief. Miss Marple stayed with him until long after dark. They said very little. "I never saw," he murmured once. "I never even suspected." "She tried to protect you," Miss Marple replied gently. "That's often the danger with love. It can blind as easily as it can guide." Outside, the village began to wind down. Curtains were drawn. Candles lit. The echo of the church bell's evening chime floated across the rooftops. Miss Marple stepped out into the night and made her way home beneath a sky heavy with stars. As she walked, she reflected not on guilt, but on cause. Isabel had not killed Harold Stemp because she hated him, nor had Felicity Dane sent those letters for sport. Both women had acted out of fear, loneliness, desperation. And Edward Sims was the smallest lie, the first dropped stitch in a pattern that had quickly unraveled into tragedy. It had all started with something so ordinary, a donation. In a parish ledger, a name added, a sum adjusted, an error disguised as generosity. And yet, beneath it had been shame, pressure, pride, that Miss Marple thought was the nature of evil in a village like Lower Wetherham, not violence or greed, but quiet desperation. The kind no one speaks about during afternoon tea. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting in her lap, the fire warm at her feet. The threads of the case had been gathered, now tied off carefully, but not without loss. She picked up a skein of pale blue yarn and cast on a new row of stitches. 1, 2, 3. Behind every stitch, she saw the faces of those involved. Isabel, exhausted with secrets. Edward, hollowed by his own panic. Felicity, trembling with the knowledge that she tried to manipulate the truth. People were not puzzles, Miss Marple knew. They were patterns, subtle, overlapping, filled with repetition and sudden breaks. You simply had to know how to read them. And Miss Marple had been reading them all her life. In the week that followed, Lower Wetherham began its slow return to order, not the same order it once knew, but something gentler, quieter, touched by the faint tremor of what had passed. The news of Isabel Harting's confession spread through the village with less ferocity than one might have expected. Perhaps it was because so many had suspected something amiss and were, in some way, relieved to learn the truth, or perhaps it was the nature of the woman herself, composed, dignified, always helping at church functions and knitting blankets for the infirm. It was difficult, even for the most rigid gossips, to speak too cruelly about her. She had done something unforgivable, yes, but out of fear, not malice. The Crown decided not to pursue a full prosecution. Given the circumstances, Isabel had no prior offences, had cooperated fully, and the act, though criminal, had not been premeditated. The conclusion was accidental manslaughter, with mitigating context. A formal reprimand was issued. A temporary retreat from public duties followed. She left the village for a time, travelling to stay with a sister in Devon. The vicar, though shaken, remained. His sermons, once crisp and intellectual, became softer, more reflective. He spoke often of forgiveness, of burdens unseen, and the pews remained full. Edward Sims returned to his post at the bank, though with a lowered head and fewer words. His quiet admittance of the forged donation exposed not as theft, but as a misjudged patch for a private crisis, earned him some sympathy, not admiration, certainly, but understanding. It was discovered later that he'd been helping cover a loan for a cousin who had lost work in Bristol. He had hoped to replace the money before anyone noticed. He had not expected Harold to notice everything. His wife Audrey returned, 2-3 days after the confession. She came back by bus, alone, and entered the Sims home in silence. But those who saw them walking together later that week said they spoke more freely than they had before. Sometimes disaster clears the air in ways kindness never could. Miss Felicity Dane continued her work at the church, though with less enthusiasm. She wore her hairpin tighter, her voice softer, and while she no longer barked orders about altar flowers or hymn numbers, she could be seen lingering longer at the chapel door, watching, listening, no longer taking her place in the world for granted. The fete was postponed. Of course, there was little appetite for raffles and sponge cakes in the wake of such upheaval. But Miss Marple, ever a believer in the restorative power of simple acts, suggested something smaller, a gathering in the parish garden, just tea and buns, no donations, no lists. Let the village rest, she said to the vicar, and share one another's company without ledger or expectation. That, I think, would be a better offering this year, and so it was. On a mild Thursday afternoon, folding chairs were set up beneath the plum trees and tablecloths laid out across wooden tables. Miss Drummond brought her lemon sponge. Mrs. Jessup donated apple scones. Even young Alec Barnes, the inquisitive choir boy, handed out glasses of lemonade. There was laughter, tentative at first, then warm. Conversations drifted from books to gardens to the unpredictability of the spring weather. Miss Marple sat with her hands folded in her lap, observing, as she always did. A village, she thought, was not unlike a garden. You could weed it, water it, prune and plan and plant, but sometimes it needed time to recover from a harsh season. Only then could it bloom again. She was joined at the table by Reverend Harting. "I owe you a great deal, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "You owe me nothing," she replied. "I only followed the pattern." He looked at her, brow furrowed. "What pattern?" She smiled gently. "Human nature. It always leaves its fingerprints. Pride, fear, love, each has its own rhythm. You can't see it right away, but if you look closely, you'll see where the stitches fall out of place." He nodded slowly. "Will you stay involved in parish matters?" "I shall continue to bake when needed," she said with a twinkle. "But I think you and Isabel will need time to decide how the church moves forward." "I shall not interfere." A pause passed between them, filled with bird song and breeze. "Do you think people will forget?" he asked. "No," she said, "but they'll forgive, in time. The forgetting comes later." That evening, back in her cottage, Miss Marple stood at her writing desk, recording the final thoughts in her small green notebook. She never called it a casebook, but in truth, it held decades' worth of observations, entries like footprints on a woodland path. Parish donation mystery, she wrote in neat cursive, key details donation forged by Edward Sims to disguise shortfall, entry caught by H. Stemp, who recorded suspicions. Poison delivered via sugar cube, prepared night prior by Isabel Harting. Motivation fear of scandal harming husband, secondary manipulations by F. Dane typed notes to protect vicar and misdirect inquiry, resolution confession, reconciliation, no formal trial. Community response guarded but healing. She closed the book, exhaled softly, and crossed the room to the window. The sky was softening into twilight, one by one. The cottages across the lane flicked on their lights, little yellow glows in square-paned windows. Miss Marple drew the curtains, poured a modest glass of sherry, and sat beside the fire. Her knitting remained untouched on the armrest beside her. Instead, she let herself rest not in triumph, not in sorrow, but in quiet contemplation. Solving a mystery, she often thought, was not about brilliance, it was about patience. And above all, about listening, because the truth, like a village secret, always finds a voice. You just have to be still enough to hear it.